Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I am here with my colleagues, Seda and Erik, and we're hoping to talk to you about sleep, light exposure, and integrating wearables and technology related to assessment of these factors into the clinic. So the order of operations today, Seda will go first, and then Erik and I will round it out, and feel free to put any questions that you have in the Q&A throughout, and we will plan to answer them at the end. And we thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, are my slides visible? Okay, hi everyone. Today I just want to caveat I'm having a cough, so if I cough, I'm sorry about that. My voice is going a little bit, but I'm going to try my best. Today I'm going to be talking about the light sleep symptom axis in mood and neurocognitive disorders. Let's see. So, sleep and light exposure, these are common things we all experience obviously every single day as humans. And in clinical care, we see them across the board, across so many disorders, but they often tend to be treated as sort of side issues or background variables. But today I'm going to be focusing on just how primary sleep and light exposure can be, and that they're not really peripheral and they need to be more central because they are highly central drivers across psychiatric and neurological conditions. So sleep and light exposure, like I'm going to talk about today, are considered transdiagnostic regulators of brain function, and they're neurological modulators of symptom expression. So I'm going to talk about how they influence different symptoms across different disorders. And like I've mentioned, and we all know, in the DSM, so many symptoms are shared across disorders. Comorbidity diagnostically is the norm, so people are often meeting criteria for anxiety, bipolar disorder, PTSD, all at the same time. And again, we see sleep disturbance as very common along the lines of all of these. I'm also going to talk about the clinical relevance of like aberrant light exposure and bright light interventions, just kind of briefly, and we'll go into that in the other talks as well. And then really go into just how sleep and light disruption shapes symptoms and some of the different disorders that I've chosen. This is not an exhaustive list. I'll kind of jump into that and we can just dive into how sleep is not just a symptom, but can even be causative of certain symptoms and it predicts severity in different disorders. So just a brief kind of overview of sleep is very central to many key brain mechanisms. It is not a passive neurological phenomenon. It's very active. It is something that helps us with emotional regulation, cognitive control, memory consolidation, pain modulation, which I'll talk more about later as well, sensory filtering, prefrontal inhibition. This is really big for things like symptoms like intrusive thoughts and hallucinations, which are highly severe psychiatric presentations and can lead to more and more severity and problems if untreated. And glymphatic metabolic clearance, this is major in neurodegenerative disorders. So, again, going with the theme of sleep disruption is not just a symptom, but it's a symptom driver. And then we get into the sleep light interaction. So with mood disorders, there are some that we know very well. We all kind of know, like seasonal affective disorder, we all understand that it's huge with the sleep light interference being causative and causing the symptoms. So, the circadian dysregulation, it's really a light sleep timing disorder. And there's a lot of evidence that the primary intervention is to use bright light therapy as first line. And we pair that with reducing some of the aberrant light exposures in nighttime and then regulating the sleep-wake cycle. Um, and this sort of goes along with major depressive disorder. Most people with depression have chronic insomnia or are sleeping excessively in the daytime, end up in restrictive environments where they're in dim lighting very often. And then once again, there have been studies that have shown bright light therapies can be protective and can lead to improved sleep, which of course can then improve other symptoms. Anxiety disorders often have sleep fragmentation, and this is highly predictive of next day anxiety or panic disorder or panic attack symptoms. once again, with some indication that bright light improves sleep. Bipolar disorder, a lot of, clinically and research indicates that many people that have sleep disturbance might even not sleep a day or two. That could be indicative and predictive of a pretty severe or often a manic episode to follow. So sleep can again be predictive of these major symptoms later. And once again, the theme continues that, bright light or reducing light exposure in the evening, aberrant light exposure can help with symptoms. PTSD, it's highly known that patients experience insomnia, nightmares, and fragmented sleep. But again, sleep is seen as the sideline element, when in reality and clinically, often after trauma exposure, individuals experience insomnia, but this is not something that's targeted, but it has been shown to end up almost preceding and even in some ways predicting PTSD development when insomnia goes untreated in individuals exposed to trauma. And of course, REM fragmentation has been shown to increase nightmares and intrusive thoughts. These are clinically significant symptoms. Intrusive thoughts are highly correlated with suicidality. So these are really important symptoms to either, prevent or to be managing early on in the disorder. And again, interestingly enough, blue spectrum morning light has shown to improve PTSD symptoms, and it even promotes fear extinction. So it's, literally kind of desensitizing the brain back. Like this very hypervigilant brain is being controlled. Now to go forward, traumatic brain injury, I think, is an interesting one. Again, clinically in the past, and even unfortunately still in the present, one of our mainline interventions is just to keep people in dark rooms and reduce their activation. This is like, we call this cocooning. Unfortunately, again, and what this does, it disrupts like your sleep-wake alerts. It gets you out of your sleep cycle, reduces light exposure. And we're still doing this, though the research and clinically has shown, anything past 24 to 48 hours, we're actually potentially doing harm. We want to get people back into the normal light sleep-wake cycle as quickly as possible, back into their normal activities. When they are kept in these types of situations, it leads to longer symptom duration, more fatigue, more irritability, and just worsening sleep, which of course magnifies the entire cascade. And then you often see post-concussive disorder, which one of the biggest complaints is that chronic fatigue, the lack of sleep, and as well as the cognitive slowing that then impacts people's ability to get back to work and all these other issues. And once again, light exposure has been shown to improve outcomes, as just like getting people back to activity levels has. Now, this is a really important area, major neurocognitive disorder. Now, obviously, these are degenerative disorders. We can't necessarily stop them or, prevent them, but they often come with behavioral and psychological symptoms. We call that BPSD. And 80 to 90% of patients at some point if they're diagnosed with dementia, will experience these. And these are very, very impactful on the healthcare system, put a big strain on the system, and also lead to caregiver burnout. One of the major symptoms that, again, relates to kind of light exposure and is very difficult on the system to help and to treat is sundowning. Affects 20 to 45% of individuals. And it's now being understood a lot more as a convergence of this poor sleep, fatigue, circadian dysregulation, and also reduced visual input. So to a brain that is going through this degeneration, reduced light and inappropriate light has been shown to have a lot of negative effects. There's been studies in nursing homes where they have more stable lighting and less of a contrast, like late day lighting. They actually show fewer episodes of some of these behavioral symptoms, especially the more severe ones like hallucinations, do happen less when we're maintaining lighting at a more normal frequency. So reduced evening light does seem to cause increased perceptual errors, like that low illumination can be problematic and almost a trigger in various neurodegenerative disorders. Now, the one I chose to go a little deeper into was Parkinson's. With Parkinson's disease, more so than the others, insomnia, REM sleep disorder, and daytime sleepiness are very prominent symptoms. And they do lead directly to worsening motor symptoms and mood symptoms. And the hallucinations we see with Parkinson's are highly associated with low light conditions and perceptual error. And I'll talk a little more about that, but essentially in Parkinson's, we often advise people have more lighting, especially in the evening, because a lot of these hallucinations can occur in those situations, and that can lead to a worsening quality of life overall. And it's just a low impact way of taking care of this really, really severe behavioral manifestation. So bright light therapy in these disorders has actually shown a reduction, can lead to less daytime sleepiness and fatigue, less anxiety, improved quality of life. And I've already kind of talked about the different conditions, but we really want to focus on that consistent evening lighting and reducing shadows and those types of things that seem to help with these more perceptually based hallucinations. And this is just a summary. Again, in Parkinson's, 30 to 40% of patients, and this isn't even severe, as in like Parkinson's dementia. This can be happening across the spectrum of the disorder. So it's really important to look at because reducing this occurrence can really help with quality of life and reducing other behavioral symptoms. We see it in Alzheimer's as well, except it's a little bit more in the later stages. Similarly, in dementia, it's much more frequent, and again, does seem to be influenced a lot by lighting, sleep, and can be reduced if we were paying attention to those symptoms a little more closely. Chronic pain is an interesting area. It might be one of the clearest examples of how sleep can amplify and sensitize the brain. Poor sleep increases pain sensitivity, emotional distress, and cognitive fog. And when you look at those together, you think of conditions like fibromyalgia. Almost always, it's like the trifecta. There's the pain, it's the sleep symptoms, and the chronic fatigue. And I will say, I personally work with a lot of these patients, and they often are reporting that the sleep and the chronic fatigue are even a bigger hit to their quality of life than the pain itself, which makes it so interesting and so important that we're addressing the sleep issue. But yes, fragmented sleep is directly related to a cognitive symptom, pain catastrophizing, which then makes it much more likely people with chronic pain will develop anxiety disorders, depression. And again, you have a population that's already highly medicated. If we're looking at ways to intervene without complicating the clinical picture, just focusing on sleep regularity and the morning light and these non-pharmacological approaches could be hugely impactful. And that's the same for neurodegenerative. When you're trying to treat hallucinations with antipsychotics in a population that's so sensitive already, it just opens the door for more problems. So this is just a quick summary of the impact of sleep, just briefly just showing that sleep in itself is causing so many of these other issues and predicting worsening symptoms and severity. In summary, sleep disturbance and light exposure, these are symptom drivers in all these disorders, and they're easily modifiable if we intervene in the correct ways. And light is a way that we can highly control and intervene in an effective way to reduce symptoms and also not be intervening with pharmacology in already complicated situations in patients. Low light environments. I mean, this is like kind of like low hanging fruit, right? Just reducing low light environments for people with dementia can greatly impact their symptom presentation. And then again, overall improving sleep and optimizing light. It has a lot of evidence support, and it's a really low risk strategy to help a lot of symptoms across the board. And that is all I have. Thank you so much. I will stop there.
Great. Ruth, you want me to just hop in, or are you going to say something
Go
first?
for it.
All right. I'm going to take it on then. Get my screen going. Presentation going. Move you guys out of the way. All right. Can you all see it? All right. Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you, Seda, for that lead in. Hello, everybody. For my 12 minutes, I'm going to dive a little deeper into exactly how light impacts our biology and how it can be used to improve sleep, including for people with Alzheimer's disease. First, a little bit about me. I've been a lighting researcher for over 30 years now. I've spent 10 years at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and 5 years at the California Lighting Technology Center at UC Davis, where my focus was largely on photometry and developing energy-efficient lighting systems. I went out on my own as a consultant in 2008, and in the early 2010s, I started working on light exposure measurement systems. And then in 2020, I started Blue Iris Labs to focus on developing and commercializing tools to quantify personal light exposure to be able to better understand and document the impact of light on human health. So today I'm going to start with an overview on the impact of light exposure on human health. I'm going to talk a little more about light therapy and its impact on aging populations, as well as for people with Alzheimer's disease. And then I'm going to finish up by highlighting some lighting technologies and practices that can help support human health. So here we go. To start, there are two key facts that are important to understand related to light and health. And the first is that circadian rhythms are fundamental to life on Earth. And the second is that light hitting the retina is the primary mechanism for regulating our circadian rhythms. So life has evolved on a spinning planet Earth, where the daily cycles of light and dark have led nearly all life to develop circadian rhythms, or internal clocks that help us synchronize our internal biology to the external environment. But now we spend nearly 90% of our time indoors, where we get approximately 1% of the light that we get when we are outside during the day. And then at night, when our circadian clocks are expecting darkness, we turn on our electric lights and we hold up our smartphones to our faces. So the data is pretty clear now that circadian disruption and related sleep disorders are not good for us and a risk factor for a bunch of bad things, including cancer and Alzheimer's disease. And the data also seems to suggest that the light exposure patterns that most of us experience are leading to at least some level of circadian disruption. I'm going to use this figure to walk through how light exposure impacts our health in a little more detail. For starters, I want to point out that these items over here on the left represent the physics of light. So it's basically, we're looking over here at light sources such as the sun and electric lights, and we can measure the physical properties of these sources with light meters. And over here on the right is how our biology responds to that light stimulus. The next thing I want to draw your attention to is that our neural pathways for our visual and our non-visual systems are quite different. This is critical because the different pathways respond in different ways to light exposure. Finally, this figure is helpful in defining exactly what I mean when I'm talking about light exposure. When I'm talking about measuring light exposure, I'm talking about measuring the spectrum or the wavelengths of light, the intensity or the brightness of light, timing, the time of day that the exposure occurs, duration, how long that exposure is, and light history, which is really the multi-day light exposure patterns, which we now know actually matter. I'll talk about our SPEC sensor a little more in a little more detail later, but for now, I'll just note that this is where most of our work has been focused. We've developed a wearable spectrometer that measures the physics of light, specifically the intensity and spectrum of light every minute of the day. The spec is typically worn on the chest, which I've got one on right now, which has been shown to be a good proxy for the amount of light that's hitting the eye and getting to the retina. Exploring the impact of intensity, timing, and spectrum a little bit further, I'm going to start with intensity. And the first thing I want to highlight here is that the intensity of light that we experience can change by 6 orders of magnitude throughout the day. So I'm showing here on a log scale light exposure from around moonlight, which can be less than 1 lux, up to direct sunlight, which can exceed 100,000 lux. Our eyes and our visual systems can cover this dynamic range really well, but our ability to accurately perceive this change is limited. To think about timing of our light exposure, let's consider what the typical modern lighting diet looks like versus what I call a paleo lighting diet, or the light exposure that our pre-modern ancestors might have experienced. This isn't real data, it's just an illustrative example of what the light exposure patterns of a modern human who's indoors most of the day and has electric lights on at night and little LEDs glowing on things in their bedroom experience versus what a paleo human would have experienced, who's outside during the day and in darkness at night. So for all of humanity, we've lived under bright days and dark nights every day and every night for our whole lives, or our ancestors did anyway. And now this species shared environmental input has been replaced with a wide range of experiences that vary between individuals and vary day to day for individuals. I also want to note that this is an area, a very active area of research in kind of the light and health space. So with wearable light exposures like ours, we're just beginning to really be able to quantify and see the variability that is out there in different populations and how much variability there is in individuals as well. And I think we're starting to see some evidence, and we're going to get a lot more really in the next couple of years. They'll help us be able to see how these variations correlate to measurable health outcomes, such as sleep and other things that matter. For now, it's safe to say that we've learned that bright days and dark nights are good for most people. Finally, getting to spectrum. Important starting point here is to note that the spectral response of our circadian system is different than that from our visual system. Our circadian system is most sensitive to blue or cyan light, around 480 nanometers, while our visual system peaks in the green, around 555 nanometers. This is why you often hear warnings about blue light exposure at night. This is because our circadian system is more sensitive to blue light. So while getting blue light in the morning or during the day can be helpful for synchronizing our circadian clocks, getting blue light too close to bedtime can suppress melatonin production and disrupt our circadian response. Let's look at an example of a spectrum from a couple different light sources. First, this is an LED light source that's been engineered to be circadian stimulating. It has a peak output that's near kind of crossing over with the circadian sensitivity peak. Comparing this to a blue depleted LED that's been engineered to have a minimal blue component while having a large amount of light that is outside, or that's a large amount of its output, I should say, in the visual or what we call photopic range. In this example, our visual system perceives the blue depleted light to be nearly twice as bright as the blue enhanced light, but it only has 1/4 of the impact on our circadian system. Next, let's talk about light therapy, aging, and Alzheimer's disease. First, I want to define exactly what I mean by light therapy. I mean controlling light exposure, either by going outside and getting some sun or by using electric lights to address health and wellness or medical conditions. I've mainly been focusing on light therapy as it relates to sleep and circadian health, which again, for most of us means getting bright days and dark nights. But there are a number of other conditions where light therapy has been used and likely will be used moving forward as we discover even more about the impact. But these other areas are things like skin disorders related to jaundice and eczema, where UV has been used, and red light and infrared light have also been used for pain relief and healing. And there's a lot of interesting new evidence about mitochondria function related to red and infrared light. In normal aging, the amount of light that hits our retina is reduced as our lenses start to cloud and our pupil sizes shrink. And the light spectrum that reaches our retina also shifts a little bit towards as our lens is yellow. So this shifts the light signal that our body sees even further away from our circadian sensitivity. So as a result, we need even brighter days as we age to get a similar effect. For people with Alzheimer's, there are additional challenges still. Alzheimer's damages the part of the brain that controls our internal clock, often leading to sleep problems, including sleep fragmentation, where sleep is no longer consolidated at night. A vicious cycle often occurs here where the disease progression makes sleep get worse, which leads to further disease progression. And nighttime wakefulness is often a trigger for moving people with Alzheimer's from home care to care facilities, as the burden of taking care of loved ones at all hours of the night becomes too large for family caregivers. On the bright side, there is a lot of evidence that light therapy is effective for people with Alzheimer's. I'm not going to read all these, but clinical trials and meta-studies have broadly shown that bright days and dark nights are associated with improvements in sleep and cognitive function and decreases in depression, delirium, disruptive behaviors, and risks for falls. Another thing to keep in mind is that the market for Alzheimer's treatments, unfortunately, is huge. There are about 7 million people in the US today with Alzheimer's, and it's projected to rise to about 13 million by 2050. The costs of care are expected to climb from $360 billion per year today to $1 trillion by 2050. And today there are a few good options for treatment options for people with Alzheimer's. Given all this, we believe that light therapy, specifically getting bright days and dark nights, has the potential to help many people who are currently living with Alzheimer's disease. Okay, finally, I will end with a discussion of some lighting technologies that are relevant to using light to improve health and wellness. First and foremost, you should use daylight whenever and wherever possible. Daylight is the right type of light at the right time of day for most of us. We should get outside during the day if we can and bring daylight into buildings as much as we can, especially in healthcare applications where patients might not be able to go outside on their own. Next, there are a number of circadian lighting systems that are coming on the market now. These systems typically provide a brighter, bluer light during the day and then a dimmer, redder light at night. Lastly, there are light exposure wearables available, such as our SPEC. The SPEC was developed with funding from the National Institutes on Aging, specifically as a tool to help people with Alzheimer's improve their sleep circadian health. While we've been selling our SPEC wearables primarily to researchers who are conducting clinical trials, and we've been doing that for a few years now. We're just about to release our first consumer version of it, and we're specifically targeting people with Alzheimer's or their caregivers, as well as early adopters in the general wellness wearables space. So the SPEC records a user's light exposure patterns, while our companion app provides simple feedback to help people meet specific bright day or dark night goals. Here are a number of final takeaways. Number one, bright days and dark nights are good for most people. Number two, get as much natural light as possible. Number three, timing of light exposure is important. A blue light that's harmful at night might be helpful during the day. And lastly, to really understand how our unique light exposure patterns impact our unique biology, we really need to quantify it. We need these data to really be able to see how light exposure patterns that we experience impact the health metrics that we care about. So that is it. Thank you for your attention, and I'll pass it over to Ruth.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Right, let me try to share my screen here. Right. Okay. Everyone see my screen all right? Great. Okay, so first I want to thank my colleagues for joining me in this presentation. I asked these two in particular to join me because I think they represent both sides of what's so important in the future of mental health tech, which is bringing the clinician expertise in a variety of conditions, understanding the science, and then also thinking about how to apply the science into applications that people can take into their day-to-day lives with the hope that we can then bring that data in people's individual contexts back into the clinic to be more effective. So we wanted to think about ending with how do we integrate the information that we could potentially gain from some of this technology back into the clinic, and what are some of the challenges that come up when trying to do so. So I'm not sure how many people in the audience today are clinicians versus technologists versus researchers, but hopefully we can have a conversation that includes all of us, because I really believe we'll have to work together in this next era to make the best use of the intersection of the emerging technologies and the clinical applications. All right. So hopefully my colleagues have convinced you that light and sleep are important for all of us, and certainly for individuals with emotional disturbance, cognitive disorders. Just to kind of go through it briefly again, we know and have evidence to show that light and sleep patterns directly modify mood, cognition, motivation, and behavior. That circadian disruption predicts depressive episodes, manic episodes, and suicidality. That sleep fragmentation is associated not just with current cognitive symptoms, but also with future cognitive decline. And that sleep and light exposure are not just symptoms, but also modifiable physiological levers that we can utilize as clinicians and individuals to empower ourselves and our patients for better health outcomes. I want to talk about a few populations in particular. I know that Seda covered some of the psychiatric disorders and some of the neurocognitive disorders, and I want to speak to those as well. So I think all of these patients, really, all these populations really stand to benefit from the integration of some of these sensors, technologies, tracking systems into their day-to-day lives in a way that can be beneficial for their clinical care and managing their symptoms. So in mood disorders, we talked about the need for circadian stability in order to stabilize mood symptoms. But in these individuals, there are a lot of barriers. There's often rumination, there's a lot of perfectionism, particularly with people that have anxiety disorders. You might have a patient who wants to do their sleep diary or sleep tracking perfectly, and if they mess up one day or another day, they might have trouble getting back to it and feeling like they can re-engage, a lot of shame spiraling around the data. But I think as clinicians, there's an opportunity to really use the circadian tuning and some of the tips that we might have for our patients about their light exposure and sleep improvement as a kind of masked behavior activation, which might be more difficult to do if we were just talking about their depression or anxiety symptoms on their own. In more serious mental illness, in bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, these individuals need a structured daily routine, certainly also circadian stability if we're thinking about manic episodes and reducing the frequency and severity of manic episodes. For many of these individuals, they live and move in chaotic environments. There's some variability in adherence depending on their symptom presentation. And for folks with a little bit more paranoia, there's a legitimate fear of being monitored. And so if we're tracking someone through their phone or in their environment, it's more likely to activate some of that concern and reduce engagement. But in these individuals in particular, I think there is a really unique opportunity to identify a drift in their baseline. So noticing early when someone's sleep pattern begins to shift, their nighttime light exposure begins to shift, and then as a clinician, potentially having an opportunity to say before someone ends up in a full-blown manic episode, it seems like there's been a change. What are some of the other things that we should keep an eye on? What kind of additional support might be useful to lower the risk, say, of hospitalization or more severe symptoms? In terms of multimorbidity, medical comorbidity, I'm thinking mostly about older adults. But what these individuals might benefit from are simple, actionable cues and accountability in terms of managing their sleep and routines. Some of the barriers might be lower health literacy, difficulties with other comorbid health conditions, such as medication and appointment timing. But I think there's really an opportunity to integrate some of these trackers and data sources with other health metrics, such as medication interactions, medication timing, and other symptoms. And then we've talked a bit about those with cognitive decline, but certainly these individuals benefit from routine and caregiver support. Of course, there are the problems of low insight and inconsistent use, particularly if they're required to charge a device or check an app. But I think there's a real opportunity to include environmental automation and caregiver engagement for optimal benefit among these individuals. So there's a lot of different ways that we can use our kind of ecosystem of sensors to get the most and most helpful data across clinical populations. We have a tech that lives on the body. Erik was just talking about his spec that lives on the shirt, which is great. We've got our rings, we have smartwatches, now they've got headbands, we have smart mattresses, under mattress sensors, ambient light sensors, smart bulbs, and circadian lighting systems, as Erik was describing. And then we have proxies. So we have our screen time on our smartphone, other metrics for measuring light exposure as well. So we track all of these things, and then all the data flows into these apps, and we get these scores and trends and graphs. So the problem is not that we lack data understanding what's happening with our sleep. With the light exposure, I think there's a lot of room to grow, which is why it's so exciting to hear about tech that includes that data in addition to the sleep data, which is a lot more readily available, sort of integrated in our current systems. The problem is that none of this is really structured in a way that fits into our current paradigm of mental health care. So there isn't really a clear path from the signal that might come into an app to the clinical summary to a specific feasible behavior change for a real patient with depression, cognitive impairment, or low health literacy. So I want to think about this gap where we've built a rich measurement ecosystem, but we haven't necessarily built the translation layer that clinicians and patients actually need in order to benefit from these advances in technology. So in terms of those integration challenges, I think the core difficulty at present is that we have this assumption that data leads to insight, which leads to behavior change, and that's not how our minds really work, especially in psychiatric populations. Although if it did, many of us would be out of a job. So there's something to be said for that. So we know that data is plentiful, but insight is scarce, and the two don't necessarily correlate. Patients bring in raw data, their clinician can't necessarily interpret it quickly. They might not have time to go through the app dashboard. It's hard for them to identify how clinically meaningful the information is without knowing how the metrics are derived. I think there's a real problem with this illusion of self-tracking competence. I certainly fall into this myself. I have this idea that if I'm tracking the variable, I'm somehow intervening to improve it, which might be true, but is often not the case. There isn't really much workflow integration. I would say that's reasonable from a privacy perspective. We don't have things that are integrated in our decision-making pathways. There are a lot of potential liability concerns there, and certainly not into our electronic health records. And there's no built-in behavioral scaffolding in a lot of these tools. We get the data, here's your sleep score. It might ask you, what do you think contributed to it, but doesn't really tell you what to do next. So the patient sees the metric, it doesn't tell them what to do, when to do it, how to make the change, how to make the behavior stick, what level of support is needed in order to do so, and then most importantly for these individuals, how to adapt when they're in distress. So I think there's a place where both the clinicians can intervene in their kind of zone of genius, and then the technologists can as well. So patients change behavior, in my experience, only when the ask is tiny, context attuned, and emotionally tolerable. And what clinicians know is that data doesn't drive action, feasibility does. So if the smallest step is too big for someone, nothing happens. In clinical practice, perfect is the enemy of good enough, and a simple measure that reliably shifts behavior is worth more than a precision metric that doesn't. We have to think about the complexity of the patient's environment, and psychosocial stressors that vary determine what feels possible at any given time. And then again, insight doesn't equal capacity. So there's motivation, avoidance, cognitive dysfunction. Those are all potentially limiting factors. But on the bright side, technologists know that these data sources reveal patterns that no human, no matter how brilliant the clinician, could possibly detect on their own, and that good user design in those systems beat the heroic willpower that we try to have, which is certainly limited in a lot of these conditions. And then we really have the benefit that these algorithms can detect risk trajectories far earlier than either self-report or even clinician awareness if you're seeing a patient on a schedule that doesn't necessarily align with their symptom variability. And another thing that I'm also interested in is that even non-adherence with some of these technologies becomes a risk metric. So even the way that people are using it becomes something that can be brought into the care environment. I think therapists in particular, psychotherapists, are particularly well primed to be able to have conversations around resistance on a more process level, which is a bit tougher to do if you're just talking about the data that someone's bringing in. So I'll go briefly through some of the populations that we've discussed in terms of opportunities that we can use as clinicians to integrate some of these tools into our sessions with patients. So in those with depression and anxiety, we want to highlight regularity, not perfection, emphasize those morning outside minutes for those with depression, reduce data shame through cognitive restructuring tactics, try to give people contextualized nudges, which can potentially be tied to their mood state, and then using, again, the circadian tuning as a behavioral activation tool. For SMI, we want to track sleep regularity as an early relapse signal, build systems that respond to deviation from baseline, and potentially build a pathway to share that information with clinicians and care partners, avoid real-time over-notification to minimize paranoia, and prioritize stability. I'll have my little soapbox moment for our older adults. I believe that the tech that's being built currently does not account for our biggest growing demographic, which are older adults who already have a harder time integrating new technology, let alone the exponential leaps with AI that we're seeing, let alone if there's cognitive impairment. And I think we really need to be building for a diminished cognitive capacity, both for our own future and also for those who are currently going to be needing this technology and thinking about it in a really serious way. But some ideas, we can provide one actionable suggestion, something that's more manageable, avoid numerical overload, so having a much simpler dashboard for these individuals, trying to link suggestions to daily habits, and then support caregiver engagement, perhaps with someone that's a little bit more tech savvy in the family. Then finally, for cognitive decline, we've talked a lot about this, but we want to think about changing the environment or tracking the environment rather than the person. Passive sensors, which can notify caregivers, which can increase autonomy for as long as possible, which I think is really of value for a lot of our patients. Simple AM and PM queuing, and then avoiding interfaces that require kind of higher level cognitive skills. So thinking about how we translate the data into action, we want to sense the information, capture it, and most importantly, change over time. I believe we really need clinicians to be interpreting the information alongside patients, highlighting patterns, not the metrics themselves, and making it clinically useful and thinking about the person's goals in treatment and their symptom presentation, identifying tiny achievable behaviors and giving people positive reinforcement over time, helping them scaffold their environments both in and out of session to make the best use of these tools, and then having really a lot of flexibility to make sure we're adapting to their context. And I will say, I'm talking a lot about wanting to bring clinicians into these conversations. Clinicians need to be willing to discuss the use of these tools with their patients and not be rigid about integrating them into treatment. Now I see so many people coming in, they want to show me their average sleep hours on their phone. They want to show me what's happening on their Aura Ring or what their sleep number bed is saying. This is happening. People are using these tools. And I know it's frustrating when they come into a doctor and have the doctor kind of dismiss the importance of the information that they could potentially be providing because they don't really know how to interpret it. So I really believe that there need to be more conversations about how to do so in a way that minimizes burden to the clinician, but still allows for the patient to utilize the data that is actually really helpful and certainly much better than their self-report. Okay, I'll just go quickly through these last couple of things. Obviously, a lot of ethical issues that are potential to be here, continuous data collection, vulnerability to privacy concerns. We have to be able to interpret what comes out of these algorithms. And I believe that, at least for now, clinicians should remain the interpreters of meaning for decision-making and treatment planning in these populations. So I see the kind of next generation of mental health tech as succeeding if clinicians help define the problems, patients help shape the solutions, and industry builds tools that make everyone's lives easier. So I think that innovation can't scale without buy-in from clinicians and patients. We as clinicians determine buy-in and adoption. We are the gatekeepers to these vulnerable populations. And when tools add burden or bypass our judgment, it's really a problem for adoption. So we should be included in future research. We want models that are built on real world functioning, not ideal use behavior for an ideal patient that doesn't exist. We want to test interventions in the clinical context and define the clinically meaningful endpoints that also have an acknowledgement of the uncertainty and the limits of interpretability and understanding of how the data are being used. So I believe that we have data generated from technologists. As clinicians, we can generate change and meaning, and we really have to work together in order to do both. Okay, I think my co-presenters in the conference have some references here, and love to have a few minutes, I think, for questions. If anyone has any questions, if not, I have some questions for my colleagues here. I was hoping to first start out by asking Seda if you have any thoughts about how you might integrate some of the data, or if you already do, specifically with your pain patients, how this comes up in session, and if you work with your patients in kind of tracking any data between sessions and how you're utilizing that.
Yeah, I work as the psychologist for a chronic pain program at a in a hospital setting. It's an 8-week program, and actually it's very data. There's a lot of work to be done, but there is a lot of tracking, but we're not using technology to do it, but we could be. But we do ask patients to very intensely track their sleep and other habits throughout the program. And some of our patients actually have the Aura Ring. So we've been incorporating some of that data just because we do have more time with the patients. But again, this is not a luxury most providers have. But I think in like our setting, We will kind of try and incorporate that data and track it that way, and it does help quite a bit. I mean, I think when the patients are able to see improvement over time and data-driven improvements, and also just see the evidence between, they have very poor sleep and their pain levels are really high, it makes a big difference. I think with chronic pain specifically, the psychological experience of it is so distorted. It's not to say that people don't have the pain they think they have, but truly that's kind of the case is, I'll ask chronic pain patients, what's your pain? They just say it's always a 10. It's not true. Just like with depression, you're not always sad. There's fluctuation and the tracking exposes that and it gives people a sense of control. And the tracking, like with Aura Ring, let's say, it shows people, wow, I really had really fragmented sleep. And my pain levels are really, really off the charts for my fatigue levels. And it just gives them a sense of control. It unmasks, like these mysterious symptoms or why is this or what. So I think just the tracking, but I think there's a way, like you were saying, with some of this technology, if it's used right and if the providers are um, trained in it and know how to apply it, and if the infrastructure is there, it's extremely, extremely powerful because I see this with most clinical populations as an extreme kind of oversimplification of your own symptoms and a sense that they're kind of mystical, when really there's a lot of like kind of like simple things that are causing most of it, like the low-hanging fruit. And if we could just address those, we can make a big impact.
And Erik, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how you would ideally like to see caregivers, patients utilize your technology. Do you think that there would be some ideal type of psychoeducation for patients and families? Do you think it would also include environmental modifications in addition to use of the tech? It's so helpful to hear you talk about the science of the light exposure and why it naturally changes with age and with neurodegeneration. And I imagine that on its own would be really helpful for giving people a sense of understanding and control.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts around that. One, I think that, and we've seen this we've done a couple of kind of small clinical trials on our own. They're mainly focused on kind of compliance and do people, including people with mild cognitive impairment, respond to recommendations for changes in light exposure. And I think on a first order, I think just there is some value, at least from light exposure and just seeing what you experience because it's not something that most people think about. And it's certainly not something you think about kind of how did that whole week go? If you can actually look at, okay, these were the days I had day or, days I had bright days and these are how I slept after that. So
Mhm.
I think kind of like a Fitbit for light has some value. But I think much more value is going to come in kind of more of the personalization part of it, because I think the reality is there is people are very different, both behaviorally and biologically. And so on the biological side, um, there really is a wide range of sensitivity to light exposure. So some people just might be have their sleep be, much more impacted by their light than others. And so without even knowing if you're one of those people or not. So having some data where you're able to correlate your light exposure inputs, as I kind of call it, to your sleep outputs, I think would be super valuable. And I think that would allow people, and I think, yeah, what's kind of happened with Oura Ring and Apple Watches and the ability to, or just the fact that I think it's something like a third of the population now tracks their sleep nightly. So people are looking at these numbers already and kind of, comparing their scores and showing them to their clinicians. If they had additional tools that are, what do I do about it? And, things like have a regular bedtime and kind of think about sleep hygiene and gaslight exposure being an element of that, I think can really make a difference. And then I think that there are, either on the behavioral side, um, especially thinking about Alzheimer's and kind of as it progresses, people, have very different experiences with that. And some people, I think, especially as it progresses, just isn't practical to have this thing that you wear on your shirt on the outer layer at all times. It's not going to work for everyone, but for some people, it's no problem. And I think, and especially kind of earlier, with people who have mild cognitive impairment, for example, who really want to be active about doing everything they can to try to kind of slow the progression and improve their symptoms. I think that information, especially if it's kind of closed loop to, here are my behaviors and here are how I'm able to quantify my light exposure side of it. And here are the things that I, am tracking, whether it's my sleep or my kind of cognition over time, and connecting those two. And I think that's where, AI, of course, is going to help us be able to do that more seamlessly and accurately over time.
Yeah.
Amazing. Any final wishes for if you can imagine how this field looks in, say, 5 years with all the advancements in AI? Are there things that you would like to see created or integrated that aren't currently available for
To
both of you?
say, do you want to go ahead and
Um, yeah, I mean, I have a lot of fantasies about that. I think AI, that what I love most about it is how it integrates for us and summarizes and simplifies, because that's, I think, the hardest thing, especially in a busy medical day to do. So I imagine just if we have all these data points and if there's a way that it could just pull it all together for us, put it in our chart, and then show us like a visual, and put it all together. I mean, that's like super, super powerful. And then the patient also feels heard, and we're actually using the data because, like you had said, Ruth, I mean, the data, we have the data, but like, what do you do with it? Like, and I think AI is the answer, right? It like brings the data to life for us. And again, I think what Erik's talking about, the individual factor, I think that is where AI is going to take us, really individualized health, which is where it should always be. Statistics is so limited. Population level does not apply to the individual. So AI, I think, is finally going to maybe really allow us to do that and really individualize care. I mean, Erik, you could say more about it, but I was doing a deep dive in light stuff because I haven't done too much with that myself. But even reading about how late night is different biologically for all of us. Like a late night biologically is 8 p.m. for one person and 11 p.m. for someone else. So that drastically impacts what your light should be. And I mean, talk about vulnerability to depression and all of that. I mean, it's such a huge, just that data point alone, I think for me is so powerful in terms of how we might intervene. So yeah, I think that's kind of the fantasy that I have about it.
Yeah, I think I have a pretty similar answer. I think that the amount of data that we get from wellness devices, if we even want to just stop there and kind of think about the Oura rings and the Apple Watches and kind of where that's probably going anyway, there's going to be more and more people gathering that information, and it's going to be getting more and more accurate, and kind of medical grade, and to the extent that that information can be gathered up and organized and piped into healthcare settings. I think certainly that'll make it that much easier for technologists like us who are kind of having, things on the inputs side, behavioral changes, that we're able to see, is this change having the expected effect? Are you one of those highly sensitive to light people or not? Or, and just I think where we're looking at going is, yeah, really personalizing that to be able to say, yeah, if I give this talk in 5 years, hopefully I'm not going to say, bright days and dark nights are good for most people. Hopefully I'll be able to say, our thing or these things that are out there now, they'll tell you exactly what is good for you. It'll give you very personalized recommendations or notifications based on a deep look at you and your outputs and say, get this, get this type of light at these times of days and avoid this type of these times.
Great. Thank you both so much for joining. I think we're out of time. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.